Okay, so, something that I've been intrigued by for years was the Kurt Cobain conspiracy theory claiming that Kurt didn't in fact actually commit suicide, which it's been fascinating for years. Ever since I can remember, I've been a huge Nirvana fan, finding out about their music, learning to love it, and it brought so much joy to me. It was just something so different, something nobody else has ever done before. Kurt Cobain obviously was one of the most talented songwriters and performers. There was a huge amount of disappointment when he died. But over the years, a lot of things became fishy. A lot of things were questionable. There was a lot of parts in the story that just didn't add up.
You mentioned in Rolling Stone about another note that he wrote to you.
It's like a letter.
Where'd you find it? Where did you get it?
It was in my bedroom under my pillows.
There's only one problem with that, Courtney.
What?
I looked under your pillows. That note wasn't under your pillows on the bed.
Didn't make any sense, which led a lot of people to try and get that information out and try and find out the truth about the story of Kurt Cobain. So I've done countless hours of research, and I've decided I'm gonna make this series, and let me tell you, it is a fucking roller coaster. It is an emotional ride, especially if you're a Nirvana fan and a Kurt Cobain fan, and it becomes dark and twisted. Let's find out the truth about what actually happened to Kurt Cobain. Was it suicide? Or was it murder? That's the question. Alright guys, let's do this.
Because you've achieved so much success, so quickly, so surprisingly, you've had a baby, you're married. What excites you now?
My baby and my marriage. I don't know. I still like playing too.
Don't even know where to start with this story. So we need somewhere to start the story off. I assume most of you guys coming to watch this video probably know who Kurt Cobain was. For those of you that don't know, I'll give you a little bit of backstory. Kurt Cobain was the legendary frontman of a band named Nirvana.
Nirvana.
They rose to fame by reinventing the rock world back in the early 1990s. By 1991, Nirvana was on top of the world. This made Kurt Cobain one of the most famous people in the world. After rising to fame, Kurt Cobain met a crazy psychotic bitch named Courtney Love. Within a short time frame of marrying Courtney Love, Kurt and Courtney both had a daughter named Frances Bean Cobain. It was a well-known fact that Frances was the love of Kurt's life. This point is actually very important to the story. Kurt unfortunately wasn't a lavish sort of person and known more in the tabloids and news to be a junkie. Because Kurt Cobain was typically that very rock star type of dude who took a lot of drugs, this led a lot of people to believe that sometime between April 4th and April 8th, 1994, Kurt Cobain took his own life with a shotgun that he had recently purchased.
Tonight, word of an untimely death. Kurt Cobain was the lead singer of the group Nirvana.
At some point in time, while Kurt Cobain was missing between March 30th and April 2nd, he was reported missing. During this time, Courtney Love decided she was going to hire somebody named Tom Grant, who was a personal private investigator, to find out where Kurt was.
Call out while you're in there. Call out and say, Kurt, hello, Kurt. You know, make a lot of noise.
Kurt?
Thanks to Tom Grant, there's a lot of information that could be accredited to him based on the Kurt Cobain case. This helped a lot of people understand that there were a lot of anomalies and holes to the story as to what exactly happened to Kurt Cobain. The story of Kurt's potential murder or suicide, whatever it is that you want to call it, really started well before that, while he was on tour in Europe. It would be a good point to make that a lot of people, including his friends, stated that during this tour he was completely clean. It was even evident that he was constantly just drinking water. So listen to this. While Kurt Cobain was on the European tour, it was well noted by his friends, his bandmates, the record label. Kurt Cobain was completely sober during this tour. He had cleaned up his act pretty well entirely. He may have been a junkie before, but at this point, he was trying to straighten out his life because obviously things are now becoming more important in his life. He's maturing, and simply he had decided that he didn't want to do drugs anymore. And there's also many more good points as to why he stopped doing drugs altogether. It was well reported and well noted that the suicide attempt in Rome was in fact an accident, or so they said. But there may be more to the story. According to what we know, what happened in Rome exactly was that Kurt was already kind of making up his mind that he didn't want to be with Courtney Love anymore and was ready to get a divorce. And he also wanted custody of Frances. So they ended up having a bit of an argument, and Kurt ended up writing a note, I guess, explaining to Courtney that he wanted a divorce and that he wanted full custody of Frances, and that would be the end of it. And of course, because Courtney Love is such a crazy psychotic bitch, she was just having none of it.
Oh shit, this is fucking hard. You know, I don't need to see a picture of Kurt, asshole. And I'm gonna have you fucking removed if you keep throwing that up. I'm not Kurt. I have to live with this fucking shit and his ghost and his kid every day. Throwing that up is stupid and rude, and I'm gonna beat the fuck out of you do it again.
So apparently it seemed like they had an argument, and as it turned out, after they argued, I guess they ended up trying to work things out, and they decided to have a glass of champagne, according to the story. What gets a little weird is that the following morning, Courtney Love wakes up and finds her unconscious husband lying down on the floor. They brought him into the hospital and they put him on life support, and he was in a dire situation at that point. He did end up waking up 20 hours later, and they did find several traces of a mixture of champagne, rohypnol, and another drug called chlorohydrate or something like that. Now, for those of you that don't know what rohypnol is, it is classically and more modernly known as a drug called a roofie. The roofie is a rape drug. I think it might be safe to assume that since Kurt had actually told Courtney that he was planning on leaving her and divorcing her and taking their daughter with him, obviously she was upset. So what maybe she decided to do was put rohypnol in his glass of champagne. According to the medical world, if you take rohypnol, a lot of the times you can't even really remember what happened a few hours before you actually took the rohypnol and passed out. So after that, pretty much Kurt Cobain had really no recollection of what exactly happened. There's a couple of really weird parts to the Rome incident. One is if you look at the original picture of Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, take a close look at how Courtney Love is dressed. It clearly looks like she took the time to obviously do her makeup and dress and make herself all dolled up and look half decent. I mean, realistically, if your husband is lying there almost dead on the floor and you're panicking, like, the first thing to come to your mind realistically shouldn't be putting lipstick on. Am I wrong about that? I don't know. The fascinating part about the Rome incident really is that while Kurt was alive, they made a good point to say that it was absolutely an accident and shouldn't have happened, right? It was just, I guess, a mixture of drugs. They partied too hard. He didn't really think about what he was doing, mixing drugs and alcohol and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, after Kurt passed away, Courtney Love's story started to completely change, and she would tell the media that it absolutely was a suicide attempt. Now, unfortunately, Kurt Cobain had already passed away at this time when she started saying these things, so unfortunately he couldn't even really defend himself. So the question is, was the Rome incident really a suicide attempt, or was it an attempt at murder?
When this happened in Italy, he got so fucked up that, you know, I found a suicide note. Now, nobody knows this, you know. I mean, obviously people around Gold Mountain and around us and Geffen, they know it, but, you know, like, the wire service, the news didn't know this, right? Everyone, it was a big accident. He was celebrating, he hadn't seen Courtney in a long time, which is true, but I fell asleep, I was real tired, and he got really depressed because he hadn't seen me in a month, and I'd been making videos and doing the LA thing and the New York thing and being all glamorous, and meanwhile he'd been playing like Slavania, right?
On March 18th, 1994, Kurt Cobain was reportedly committing suicide again. This was believed to be an attempted suicide according to Courtney Love and no one else. So here's what happened that day. Courtney Love called Seattle Police Department claiming that Kurt Cobain had locked himself into a room with his guns and was about to commit suicide. An officer by the name of Everest Edwards was the first one on scene, and he gave us a bit of a play-by-play as to exactly what happened. According to the officer, Courtney Love was outside of the house yelling things out like, he's locked himself into a room, he's got a gun, and he's going to fucking kill himself. Officer Edwards at this point called in for backup. 2 officers went in through the front of the house, and Officer Edwards and another officer went to the back of the house when something surprising happened. Kurt Cobain was in the backyard, and it appeared that he was pretty embarrassed about the situation. Based on the conversation with Officer Edwards, it's pretty clear that Kurt Cobain didn't want to commit suicide, as he told the officer and explained to him, and it pretty well just seemed that he really wanted to get away from Courtney. The interesting part of the story here is that it appears that Courtney Love admitted that she made up the entire story. The interesting part of this story is the fact that Courtney Love pretty much admitted that she created the entire story, that Kurt Cobain was trying to commit suicide. But what would be the reason why Courtney Love would want to make up a story like that? Was it for some sort of dramatic effect? What I mean by that is, was Courtney Love trying so hard, desperately, to already convince the media and everyone else that Kurt was suicidal? Did she already have everything planned out to complete his murder? Keep in mind that as Courtney told the story later on to the media, her story continually changes. One minute, he's locked in the bathroom. The next minute, he's locked in his bedroom. Which one is it, Courtney? For such a dramatic and shocking event to happen in your life, surely you'd remember exactly where it happened. According to the actual police report, it's pretty evident what exactly went down here. Let me show you guys something. So pretty much right about here, you can pretty well see that he had locked himself in the room to keep away from, which I assume would be Courtney Love. He continued to state that he was not suicidal and doesn't want to hurt himself. So it seems pretty well obvious that Kurt Cobain was not suicidal, not at the time, and this is only maybe about 20 days before he was actually found dead. So it seemed kind of like Courtney Love was already trying to plant things in there to make it seem like it was suicide when it did eventually happen.
How's your stomach? Have you found anything to...
It's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I finally have been prescribed the right stomach medicine after 6 years of being in constant pain. Finally, I haven't had a stomach problem for like over a year now.
While Kurt Cobain was alive, it became pretty well known that he had a lot of stomach issues, which eventually pushed him to doing more drugs, pushed him to being borderline suicidal, and the only resolution to the problem and to eventually fix his stomach issues was heroin, and that's why he claimed to do a lot of heroin. That was one of the big reasons. He said there was a few others, but that was probably a pretty big, sizable issue. Heroin for a long time was the only thing that Kurt could use to solve his stomach problems. However, in 1993, he gave a pretty convincing interview, which seems relatively true to me, that they had finally found a drug that solved his problem, and his problem was completely gone, which meant he would no longer have to be dependent on heroin in order to solve his stomach problems. This clearly disproves the suicide of Kurt Cobain and clearly shows us that he was a lot healthier, he was happier, and was no longer even considering suicide at all. At the height of Kurt's career, he was happy. He had everything. He had his daughter, he had money, he had success in music, so on and so forth. He had no reason at this point to any longer even be considering suicide, considering he was happy and his stomach pains were completely gone. He was, in fact, looking forward to creating more music. He was already working on the next album by March 1993. Many of his friends even came out and said that he was clean and he was happy and he was not thinking suicide at all. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with him anymore.
That is good. There's no anything.
You got
That's
it
a
now.
lot, Kurt. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Well, I mean, if you were his best friend and he didn't say anything about being depressed or being suicidal and he just wanted the gun for prowlers and that Rome was just an accident, you know, maybe you think also he could have been murdered.
Why? I mean, it's like...
Well, if you were his best friend,
you know,
and he never said anything about anything being wrong, and he'd seen you just before, you know, maybe Tom Grant's right. Maybe he
But
was
I mean, he
murdered.
doesn't have to say anything about it being wrong. I mean, it's like, you know, when you're friends with someone, there's like subtler forms of information transfer than just flat out, you know.
So what did he subtly communicate to you?
I mean, it's like, I'm just saying, it's like, why...
Well, I'm just trying to get a sense of what he did communicate to you, what you understood.
I mean, the thing is, it's like, the time he would have been communicating any sort of, you know, sense that he wanted to kill himself was already was when he came back from Exodus, when I didn't see him, you know.
But if he bought the gun before he went, and you think he was now suicidal,
I don't think he was necessarily like planning to kill himself at that point necessarily. I mean, I don't know.
So if he would have known anything would have been wrong with Kurt, then why did he clearly never come out and say anything about it? It seems almost to me like the possibility that some of his friends may have been involved, maybe not even directly, but clearly he knew something. It's pretty obvious. He was hiding something. Even just a few days before Kurt's suicide or murder, he even wrote on AOL about things that were going on, that he was happy, that things were good, and he was looking absolutely forward to making more albums. He was working on a new album. Here's the actual letter itself. In that note, he made it pretty well notable of his plans to release a new album in 1995. Unfortunately, he would never release that new album because, well, he was dead well before then. What's also surprising to note is that Kurt did speak to his grandparents not even 2 weeks before his death. He was already making plans, I think, to go fishing with his grandfather. Even Rosemary Carroll, who was the entertainment lawyer for both Kurt and Courtney, as well as Tom Grant, obviously in conversations with each other, were not convinced that it was suicide, so there was more to the story.
But when I picked up that note and read it, it sounded phony to me.
Didn't it sound terribly phony?
It sounded like a set-up letter.
Absolutely.
And I don't know I don't know why Courtney's trying so hard to convince people that he was, and she's got the police convinced because they're saying that that's where they think he was for a couple of days. You know?
No, it's amazing is that she can do this, you know?
You're the one that filed the missing persons report.
Yeah, and I'll totally come forward with that because people wouldn't take me seriously.
Yeah.
Do you blame yourself? I mean, I know that there are fans of his who blame you.
I do.
What could you have done different? And what do you blame yourself for?
About 8,000 things. but 8,000 million things.
Could you have stopped it?
Yes.
Could you have stopped it permanently?
No, but I could have been diligent. Hold on, please.
Let's talk about something else, okay? Let's talk
No,
about
finish it.
Okay.
Damn it, finish it.
All right.
It's a well-known fact that had Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain gotten a divorce, Courtney Love would have lost literally everything. Kurt Cobain, before his murder-suicide, was reported as to have been writing Courtney Love directly out of his will. He wanted to make sure she had nothing. He was ready to move on from her, which gives us more than enough reason to believe that Courtney Love worked as hard as possible to make sure everybody believed that it was suicide and not murder. First off, when Kurt Cobain went missing, Courtney Love called the Seattle Police Department to report him as a missing person, but not with her own name. She ended up using Kurt Cobain's mother's name, Wendy O'Connor. I don't quite understand why or what reason would she have possibly needed to use his mother's name. I think what she was trying to do was apparently not scare off Kurt by using his mother's name, which clearly doesn't make any sense at all. The weird part about the whole situation is that even Wendy O'Connor to this day still seems to believe that Courtney Love had some sort of involvement in Kurt's death. Even more recent, she is clearly convinced that Courtney Love had some sort of involvement in Kurt's death. If you look at recent reports of Francis Bean Cobain's ex-boyfriend or husband or whatever he is, it seems like there's a lot of even foul play or weird things happening today. Apparently a reported weird kidnapping situation. Even Wendy O'Connor has come out and said that she didn't like doing the montage of Heck. She didn't even want her footage used in that film. And that she's even been telling Francis's ex to go and look at Soaked in Bleach. Regardless of that, Courtney created a lot of holes in her story. The fact that there were 2 suicide notes left behind by Kurt Cobain, one being the most famous, it seems like he's not personally writing it out to Courtney or Francis at all, and it seems like he's writing it out to the fans. It seems almost as if it's more of a retirement letter because at the time, Kurt had problems with his stomach, he was feeling depressed at some point, and was just not in good health. He wanted to get out of the music industry, he wanted to leave the machine, as he would call it, and it seemed like he was just kind of writing his note to say that, hey guys, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm not going to be involved in music anymore at all.
But I was in pain. I mean, I was in pain for so long that I didn't care if I was in a band, I didn't care if I was alive, you know. And it just so happened that I came to that conclusion at a time when my band became really popular, you know. I mean, it'd been going on and building up for so many years that I was, you know, suicidal. I mean, I just didn't want to live, so.
However, the problem with that, and the reason why it seems like the letter was written well before Kurt even passed away, was the fact that because his stomach problems which were a huge problem in his life, which is probably the reason why he wanted to leave music in the first place, but because these issues were no longer even in existence, it would have made no sense for him to retire, hence why later on he was coming out that he was happy, and that he was writing a new album and working on new music with the band, and none of it made sense. There was in fact a second suicide note that only Courtney Love has ever seen and found underneath the pillows, that according to this audio recording with Tom Grant, there was no letter underneath the pillows. Tom Grant actually physically checked underneath the pillows on their bed when he was looking for Kurt and looking for drugs and found nothing.
You mentioned in Rolling Stone about another note that he wrote to you.
It's like a letter.
Where'd you find it? Where'd you get it?
It was in my bedroom under my pillows.
There's only one problem with that, Courtney.
What?
I looked under your pillows. That note wasn't under your pillows on the bed.
So is Courtney in fact making up this second letter? Did it even ever exist? The letter according to Courtney was very sad, and it was a lot of him apologizing for no longer going to be there in the future for Courtney and Francis, which clearly doesn't make any sense considering the fact that Kurt was about to divorce Courtney. So why would he give a shit about writing a suicide note or letter to Courtney apologizing? Apologizing for what? According to the way the story goes, Courtney Love was pretty dead set on convincing everybody, including Tom Grant, that for some reason Kurt Cobain had committed suicide. My guess is to get everybody off her tail, since people were starting to speculate that she had some sort of involvement in his death. At one point, she even went as far as to take Tom Grant over to a bunch of cabins that they owned in Carnation to show Tom Grant that Kurt Cobain had been at these cabins just a little while before he died. While she showed him around at these cabins, it was pretty friggin' obvious that no one had been there probably in months. There was dust everywhere, spider webs, and he even found dead rats in the toilet, which meant no one had ever been around. But of course, leave it to Courtney to find a syringe somewhere in the cabin, which she was obviously trying to show everybody that, hey, Kurt was doing drugs and he was in fact suicidal, blah, 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 blah. Here's one of the funniest parts about Courtney Love. Not even her own father, Hank Harrison, was convinced that she did not have any involvement in his murder, or suicide. He even went so far as to comment on her violent nature and her hectic lifestyle.
Absolutely. As far as you said, all the books, no. This book particularly, yes. That I think it isn't so much my son-in-law, he's dead.
Yeah.
It's his legacy, number one, and well, actually number two, because number one is my granddaughter.
Mm-hmm.
Frances Bean Cobain has to know what's in this book before she can make her own mind what the hell went on. Because she's been told one version of what happened. She wasn't there. She wasn't in the room.
So Courtney's been influencing all of her opinions.
Brainwashed, total.
Yeah.
You know, like all parents do to their kids.
Yeah.
Well after Kurt unfortunately passed away, Courtney made it a point to tell everybody that Kurt was spiraling out of control, which could not have been true considering all his friends even said he had cleaned up his act and he was doing very well. She even pointed out that on his European tour, he was taking so much heroin that his arms were literally so scabbed and brutal from all the heroin. But if you look at the video, you can tell this isn't true. First of all, you can see him wearing short sleeves. If he was in fact still doing drugs and still injecting himself with heroin at the time, why would he be brave enough to be wearing a short sleeve shirt? Unless of course he was injecting it somewhere else, but according to Courtney, he was in fact doing it in his arms, considering she said that his arms were in such bad shape. But as you can see, there wasn't anything there. His arms were perfectly fine. The real junkie in the whole Kurt and Courtney case overall would have to be Courtney Love. Let's make it clear that she was the reason why he got involved in drugs in the first place. Frances Bean Cobain even stated that Courtney literally lived on drugs. She even did drugs while she was pregnant. Another weird thing to point out is that when Kurt did disappear, Courtney Love all of a sudden decided she was going to upgrade the security systems, the motion sensors, and she specifically pointed out that she wanted the work done around the greenhouse. It's almost as if she knew that Kurt's body would be found there. The crime scene of Kurt Cobain has always interested me. The only thing is that there's a lot of weird anomalies that show up in the story. Many theories have popped up over the years on the fact that a lot of evidence just doesn't make any sense and just literally proves that a lot of the points of the story could never have possibly happened. It's pretty fucked up. A lot of stuff in the case just doesn't even make sense. There's even another theory that says, according to the crime scene, that it's possible that government officials killed Kurt Cobain. Wow. This gets deeper and deeper every time I check, even more than I initially thought. The biggest problem with the conspiracy and crime scene and everything surrounding Kurt Cobain's death and the actual way that he died, assuming that he would have actually used the shotgun to kill himself and that nobody else actually did it, is a bit problematic. The first and largest thing would have to be the shotgun itself. For one, the shotgun was loaded with 3 shells. Now, if you know you're going to shoot yourself in the head, what would be the reason as to having the shotgun loaded with 3 shells? He purchased the shotgun for protection. He was worried of burglars, and so he bought another shotgun. Since his second suicide attempt, he did own guns in the past, but unfortunately those guns were taken away by the police. According to protocol, when there's a disturbance, they take the guns away. And when he was reported as attempting suicide number 2, according to Courtney Love, they did take those guns away. So he had no other option but to purchase another gun and more ammo for that gun. But again, why 3 shotgun shells? That makes absolutely no sense to me. One would surely do it with a shotgun. I don't know. Number 2 is, how did the bullet end up on the wrong side of the body? If the gun was held up, the gun would have literally had to be held up in a completely different way. So the shell should have discharged on the right and then somehow landed up on the right of the room, of course. But somehow instead it landed up on the left. No one's really been able to explain this other than the fact or the possibility that the gun may have physically spun itself after shooting himself, which I don't know if that really makes any sense. A lot of people have claimed that guns don't really do that. They shouldn't really be able to turn themselves in the opposite direction, if that makes any sense to you. The other point to make about the shotgun would have been the fact that his arms would have been physically too short to have been able to pull the trigger on his own. He would have had to use his toes, which clearly did not happen, because if you look at the crime scene pictures, he was wearing his shoes. So how would he have possibly pulled the trigger with his toe and then managed to put his shoes back on after he's already dead? The other weird and large anomaly that comes into play is the simple fact that his heroin blood level was just way too high. According to the numbers, he had literally taken 3 times the lethal dose that the drugs itself should have already made him pass out and overdose on its own without even being able to pull the trigger on his gun. He was a very small dude, so his body probably couldn't take that weird high amount of heroin, which no one's ever been able to explain before. A junkie knows that. It's like, with that much drugs in you would have literally just passed out, which would have made a lot more sense. Another huge point to make would have been the credit card that should have been in Kurt Cobain's wallet when he was dead. Kurt Cobain used only one card for pretty much all of his purchases. That was his access to all of his funds and all of his money. The problem was that when they found the body, the credit card was missing, and a credit card statement that I found shows that there was purchases made even after he was dead, literally up until the day his body was found, and then nobody attempted to purchase anything after that. Now, a point to mention would be the fact that Courtney Love says she had canceled this credit card when he went missing to, I guess, basically fuck with him and make sure that he couldn't have any access to funds and would simply come home. None of it makes any sense. Like, it shows that he bought things like flowers and, I don't know, just weird things. Apparently somebody tried to do a cash advance, and the question arises is that who was using this card? If it wasn't on his person at the time of death, who the fuck was using this card? Is it possible that he was waiting in the greenhouse to leave because he wanted to leave Seattle? He was leaving Courtney, and somebody came in and they had a little bit of a kerfuffle, as you could call it, I guess, and somebody decided to take the credit card and try to use it even after he was dead. The fact that Tom Grant went searching for Kurt Cobain with Kurt's good friend Dylan Carlson, who should have definitely known that the greenhouse existed, which means that Tom Grant and Dylan Carlson were both in the house and searched the entire house except for the greenhouse, when Dylan Carlson for a fact knew that the greenhouse existed. It makes absolutely no sense as to why he wouldn't even suggest going to the greenhouse to look just in case that he might actually be there, which means that they were both apparently there in the house while Kurt was already dead. I think one of the weirdest parts of the crime scene is the fact that the electrical worker who went in to install the alarm system and the new motion sensors was told to do it directly around the greenhouse. I don't think that was by chance. I think there's a high possibility that Courtney Love knew Kurt would be found dead there and sent him literally to that part of the house to inevitably find him dead. Another weird part about the crime scene is not really the crime scene itself, so to say, but Courtney Love made it a point again to the media to tell them that he could only be identified by his fingerprints, because which would imply which would imply that Kurt Cobain would have been so disfigured that you couldn't even really tell who he was. When in the police reports and other people who were at the crime scene itself said that no, it was pretty obvious who the person was. You could totally tell. His face wasn't disfigured. Apparently his head may have been a little bit misshapen, obviously because of the shrapnel, because of the pellets, of the actual shotgun itself, would have went there. Apparently what did happen was, because of the position of the gun in his mouth was against a hard pallet, it slowed the bullet down. So the fragmentation and the pellets that were actually in his brain there was literally no exit wound. So everything that was shot into there stayed in his head. So the fact that it's just kind of funny that why would Courtney try and tell people that it was such a grotesque situation when realistically it wasn't. You would have very well known who the person was. There's also a lot of discrepancies in the actual police report itself. For example, they said that there were marks, I guess, from firing the gun on his hands. But other people who were there reported that no, there was absolutely nothing on his hands. There was nothing, no residue from him actually firing the gun, which was obviously a bit strange. Another point would be to say that his left hand, which was his predominant hand, was the one left on the barrel. Now, I don't know if this makes any difference, but for example, I'm right-handed, so my predominant hand would be my right hand. So I'd pull the trigger with my right hand, the finger of my right hand, which would have made sense that because Kurt was predominantly left-handed, he should have been holding the barrel with his right hand and pulling the trigger with his left hand. I don't know if that's something that's true, but I would imagine that would make sense to me. I would automatically want to use my predominant hand to use for the trigger of the gun. It seemed like there was a lot of mistakes done by the Seattle Police Department, which is definitely not good. Apparently, fingerprints were found months later with no legible prints, and the shells and pen at the crime scene were not checked until 3 years later. The problem with the Seattle Police Department is the fact that when they walked in, they automatically ruled it a suicide, and that was the end of the investigation, which is a bit of a problem. Regardless of the fact whether they thought it was suicide, they're not coroners, they are not medical examiners, and they should not be automatically ruling it as suicide, closing the investigation, which to me makes sense. So, on that note, should it not be pointed out that maybe, just maybe, the Seattle Police Department should completely reopen the case and reinvestigate the situation and find out if this was actually suicide or if it was murder? People want to know. I think people deserve to know. People have been trying to find this out for years, and it's never been perfectly proven to be a suicide. There's a lot of clear evidence showing that this was, in fact, a murder. A lot of things in this case just simply don't add up, and they obviously lead to murder. They lead to some sort of foul play was happening in this situation. It's just crazy, man. I don't know. It's crazy. Even the suicide note itself doesn't make any sense. It goes from very small font to a seemingly larger font towards the bottom. And it's just kind of strange how this whole part seems to be talking about leaving the music industry, and then all of a sudden, at the end here, it seems to be for Courtney and Francis? The other question to be answered is, why did he write 2 suicide notes, which doesn't make sense, and they're both completely directed at Francis and Courtney? If you're writing one that's specifically directed at your fans, then it should end off with "to my fans" and not to Francis and Courtney, when Courtney claims that there's a second suicide note that was just for them, that was never publicized. Nobody's ever seen it other than Courtney. A lot of questions to be answered. So I just finished editing the first part of this series. But what if the conspiracy theory is wrong? What if it wasn't murder after all?